At the time that I became involved in HIV/AIDS work through the Names Project, I did not consider myself to be an advocate or an activist in any way, shape, or form. I was just this person who loved someone who lived with AIDS and died. I was looking for an opportunity to do some good, basically, and that's how the Names Project it filled that void that was there, that was missing. And I think that's how many of us clearly came to the table. It was an opportunity for us to work through the grief, the anger, the despair, and to create this community of folks, of like-minded people. When I think about all the parents who sewed quilt with love and compassion, showed up in Washington or wherever there was a quilt display and turned it over, then in that moment we were all activists. Sure, some of us were able to do die-ins in front of the White House, march with ACT UP, and really show this very vocal, loud, but not all activism is necessarily loud. I have sewn or worked on 2 panels for the quilt. One was for my partner, Brian Alosi, who died in 1989. His panel was created in early, I would say, 92. Brian Alosi worked at Ace Hardware in Foster City, where he worked in the garden, took care of plants and sold plants. His schooling, his background, his training was in, I believe, landscape design, but he loved nature and he loved flowers. And so his panel is of a garden. And so we thought it was important that that represent him, and also his love of music. So there are, I believe, a number of references to music and to nature to Brian on his panel. When working on Brian's panel, it really was a group effort. We each had a part. There were perhaps 4 of us, and we worked as a group but separately. So we were each bringing something to that panel, and mine was a reflection of just the time that I spent with Brian in a very personal way. But I also wrote the letter that went with the panel that was presented to the Names Project that is not sewn into the quilt, that remains in the quilt archives. And that really was cathartic. It was therapeutic in that it was a release. It was a very difficult, tearful moment, or moments for me. I remember I approached it with some trepidation. And finally, I just gave into the emotions and broke down, and I was able to say what was actually in my heart. But it was difficult. That I remember that as a particularly difficult process, but wholly necessary. Interesting thing about when you work on your panel, that particular panel is your sole focus at that time, and you're not necessarily thinking of it within context of these tens of thousands of other panels. And then, of course, you see it and you realize you're just one tiny fraction of this great world tragedy and pandemic. It's overwhelming to see that panel, or in however many panels one might make, as part of a much larger effort, a much larger community project, community and world project at this point. Brian died in 1989. Being a part of his passing and the community of caregivers that took care of him was such a life-altering experience that I decided I wanted to work in whatever way possible in something that addressed the epidemic, HIV and AIDS. And it so happened I was walking past the Names Project, and there was a job opportunity listed in the window right next to many of the quilt panels. And I went in, got an interview, and was hired and became the merchandise coordinator there for just under 2 years. A number of my colleagues at the Names Project back in the late 80s and early 90s came from retail. Gert herself, who's one of the founders and who's the original staffer, came from Macy's. You know, she was a makeup, perfume. She was that person spritzing you, I'm sure, in the aisle. So she came with that. Scott Lago, who worked on the design of the unfolding ceremony, he worked at, I believe it was at Gumps or Neiman Marcus. I came from Macworld magazine. We literally, and I hate to use the word industry, but we created this industry. We gave it organization and structure. So at that time, it was very welcoming. Basically, you were pulling people in off the street. If they were committed to the cause and wanted to, you could make a position for yourself. I recall when I worked at the Names Project, we talked about the power of the quilt, its ability to bring diverse people together. And yet that was very early on. Initially, it was very much male, very much white, and that was really, that's what it was at the time. And not to revise history, what is most striking to me 35 years later is the diversity of those who visited the quilt this past weekend. You had people of all ages. And at this time, I have to believe that when young people see it, because they've heard stories about uncles and brothers and aunts, stories that are shared through generations. And if they have an opportunity to, they want to see what's there, what is there. So it doesn't surprise me how the demographics have changed. It's what we always wanted, but its longevity is somewhat astounding in that it continues to survive when so many other organizations no longer exist from that same period. So because the quilt was always very, very different, it was a different tool. It was a different form of activism. Perhaps that it is its greatest strength, and that it still has the ability to touch hearts and change lives 35 years later.